Good evening and welcome to Zion's Banner. I already see that there are 6 people already in the house, and so I'm excited. We have a special guest, and you've already gotten a shalom from Brother Steve. There we go, with a cool graphic that he created. So I'm, yeah. So this is going to be a little different broadcast. Now, actually, it's not appearing on Facebook. It's appearing just on YouTube, but Glendall has a Facebook page, and he has the power to type that in, but we even have the power to go to those sites tonight and show you. Glendall is probably my first father in the faith and the first man who started teaching me Bible when I came into Student Bible Fellowship as this weird, newly saved Jewish kid. So we go back a long way, and they've been a supporting church of us since we started in ministry. Just to give you a little more of an intro, Glendall is doing podcasting now, and has his own website and his own Facebook page, and so he is just spreading out there. And doing incredible stuff. He also was this incredible dynamite algebra teacher. I sat in his algebra class, and I love language. And it was like, I wish I'd been taught algebra like this. So if you have any algebra questions tonight, we can even mix mathematics and theology. What do you know? Incredible stuff here. So Glendall, I don't even know if you ever shared your testimony at Neighborhood Bible Fellowship.
Well, yes, I have, but it might not have been during the time that you were attending, or perhaps it was in between times. My testimony goes back to being raised in a church family. In fact, my dad was a full-time auto mechanic, but a part-time preacher at a rural church, and that rural church had a tradition of inviting in an evangelist once a year. And I responded to the evangelist's invitation one night about the time I was 11 years old. And it was not like a flash of lightning or anything dramatic necessarily, but it was significant in the fact that I understood that Jesus had died to pay for my sin. And I just didn't want to put that off anymore. It seemed as though the Spirit of God convicted my heart that tonight was the night to make that choice and to make it clear in my own head. So that's what I did. And I made a separate decision a little later in my journey, you might say, after spending some teenage years, not necessarily out of fellowship, but making some very poor decisions and doing some things that I just felt there was a lot of guilt hanging on to me because of things that were transpiring in my heart and in my mind. And about the time between my freshman and sophomore year in college, I attended a concert at a local state fairgrounds, and actually I think it was a county fairgrounds, and there was a band playing that was called Good News Circle, and a preacher by the name of Bob Laurent, and that was many years ago, but he impressed me with the fact that Jesus not only died for my sins, that my life needed to be surrendered to him. My life needed to be guided by him, that there needed to be a personal relationship to him even now, that he wasn't just a savior who paid the penalty for me 2,000 years ago or so, but actually he wanted that relationship to be ongoing. And that's when I surrendered my life to what people would call his lordship, even though he's always been Lord. There's a certain kind of volitional choice I needed to make in my own mind, that my life needed to be directed by him. So that's a brief amount of my story, but it kind of catches you up perhaps on some of those details.
Hey, Chris is here. Chris is part of my story. I went back to, I lived in Vermont for a while, and Chris was a guy with Jewish background who was involved with one of the gals at the church that I attended. And she had some questions about how to talk to Chris. And so I actually got to baptize Chris. So Chris, this was the guy who was my first father in the faith and Bible teacher. So this kind of like full circle here. This is like great.
It's amazing. That's great.
Yeah, this is just a lot of fun. Now, your ministry actually, well, first of all, you might want to tell us who Hal Green was, because you didn't just go from that meeting to dealing with weird college students like me.
No, I knew that as a result of that choice that night in that county fairgrounds, with the music of Good News Circle and playing in the background, that decision was going to lead to other decisions. And I knew, not immediately, but over a process of evaluating where I was going to spend the rest of my college career, that I decided to go to a Christian college called LeTourneau, and it's currently now called LeTourneau University in Longview, Texas. And that's where I spent 2 years absorbing about as much Bible as I could. Then after that, I came back to Southern Illinois, and I was campus minister with the denomination by which I grew up in. My father's denomination, my grandpa's denomination, they had a campus ministry office, and that opened up for me to interview with them. I served there for about 3 years, and then I resigned from that position because I wanted to find a biblical source, a place where I could grow, a place where I felt like a local church that could preach God's word in an expository fashion. And that's where I discovered Cape Bible Chapel in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. And Mr. Hal Green was a gifted evangelist, but also he was a gifted Bible teacher. It's very rare, I have found since, that you find both of those gifts so eloquently composed in the one single human being. And Mr. Green was one of those. And I sat under his preaching for a couple of years before we planted the church called Neighborhood Bible Fellowship. But even before we planted the church, we still had a college Bible study that was meeting in our home, and it was called Student Bible Fellowship. And that was the germination, you might say, of the planting of the church, was because of all these college students. They were getting older. Some of them were getting married. And we decided, well, the best way to make disciples is to ground them in a local body of believers. And that's the reason why we started a neighborhood Bible fellowship. And that would have been December of 1978. And I'm not quite sure of the exact years you were there, Dr. Jeff. but that's the kind of the short game of that whole episode.
The sad part is noticing the gray hair and the increasing scalp space. I'm not sure I remember what years I was there. That's horrible.
There's been time past.
Yeah. I was telling my daughter a story. You might not even have this backstory. Big Bill was a guy who came back to school from the Navy. And hey, I got to say hi to our sister down under. That's Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you're joining the guy who was my first spiritual father in the faith and an incredible expository preacher. We're going to explain that term again. They've heard it before, but it's always good to explain your terms. And Big Bill, I never told my daughter this story until this afternoon. I went upstairs and was talking with her, and we were meeting in this building that needed the furnace stoked. It was a coal furnace. I remember this thing. And Big Bill had taken me, and he walked me down to the Dairy Queen. There was this strip of like bars, and there was a Dairy Queen. We called it like Dogtown. It was within walking distance of our dorm. And I remember him taking me down there. I thought I was getting a free ice cream, right? And Big Bill turns to me and he says, the furnace needs stoking tomorrow before the worship service. I'll be at your room at about 5:00. And sure enough, it was like, okay, this is what the Lord wants me to do. He knocked on my door at like 5:00 in the morning, and we went over to get the heat going. And I think we had to put the chairs out back then. And so that was my introduction, in his words, that your faith means service. So that was kind of a story that I hadn't told my daughter, but it just kind of came flooding back to me that 5:00 knock on the door.
That is that's also a brief commentary on the character of Big Bill. He was a strong believer in what you just said, that he believed that your faith included serving, and that serving sometimes included some little bit of sacrifice.
I kind of wish that faith included a cup of coffee before we got to the place where we were stoking the furnace, but that's just personal.
Exactly.
We used a term that I want to, just in case you haven't heard it, although you probably heard it from me. These guys are always hearing from me about authorial intent. But expository preaching has to do with just going verse by verse through the Bible books. When I first met Glendall, he was going through Philippians. Okay, that was actually the first book. The first time I came to Neighborhood, you were in Philippians.
Cool.
Which was the first New Testament book that I had ever heard. Because our Bible at home didn't include the New Testament.
Of course.
And so the first New Testament book I was exposed to was the book of Philippians. And I still remember that.
That happens to be my favorite New Testament book. It includes my motto verse, which is the phrase from Philippians 1:21, that you need to live as Christ and to die is gain. And I have that on a little rubber stamp that I stamp inside of every book in my library. I used to stamp it on every correspondence, but I got out of that habit.
Okay. So that's kind of where things happened way back when we met in different buildings. It was about the time I left that Neighborhood Bible Fellowship actually had a building of its own. And it was good for me because I really saw what a church looked like when it was sort of being built from the ground up, in a sense, because we didn't have a building, which means we didn't really have midweek programs in the same way that a church did. What we did have was called shepherd groups.
Yeah.
Now, shepherd groups were real important for us college kids. And they were important for me because I was a new believer with the Jewish home, and home was very hostile for me. You go back to your Jewish household, and I remember they did not want me playing WMBI, which was the radio station for Moody Bible, in the house. I used to go upstairs and sneak listening to stories of great Christians in my room where no one could hear me. And so these shepherd groups, an older couple, and I'm using that relatively because we were all college students, would have some of the students over on, was it a Sunday night?
They varied in terms of like when they could meet or when they did meet, depending upon the host and their evening they wanted to do that. But that was, in fact, those shepherd groups, to give another side of the story, so to speak, we decided that some of the best ways to grow a young church was not by merely meeting for what you might call the formal meetings on Sunday mornings, but a more informal setting where we could get together and kind of hold each other accountable, pray for each other, maybe have a Bible study, but mostly to be able to get to know each other. And we felt that one of the key ingredients was to avoid breaking things in our church, breaking them down into ages by division. We wanted to break them apart more by who was going to be the host and where it was going to be located and what time of the week. And we intentionally wanted college students with young couples, young families, and other people in the mix, because college students sometimes get accustomed to what I would call peer group ministry, which is okay. And it's very, very valuable to find your own peers and find fellowship among your own peers, find that motivation that comes from those people that are closer to your age. That's very, very important. But it also is very important that you see Jesus lived his life through the lives of family people, of fathers, of mothers, of children, of homes. And that, because that is where the college students are going to be. They're not going to be in college in an infinite amount of time, although maybe some of them might be, I don't know. But but it means that you want to prepare them for living out Jesus's life in what it means to be, not just as a minister or not just as a college student, but also perhaps as a lawyer or as a brick worker or as a welder or as an auto mechanic or a construction worker, and or have to see Jesus in the life of a mother or as a wife, and that we felt was way more valuable than just segregating age groups into different places. So that was our strategy behind that, Jeff.
I just know that it was incredibly important for me because there was a sort of explosion that occurred at my house. And so there was a lot of kickback. And so I sort of inherited a family. And you have to remember that having no church background, I knew nothing about doing Christian stuff. I mean, I didn't know, what this was supposed to look like. And so I was trying to navigate a lot of life at that time period. And there was just a lot of formative stuff that ended up happening. Had some particular thought on my mind. I remember, you guys probably don't know it. I've gotten back to a little poetry writing. We went to a weekend to remember, me and my bride, so I could learn to be a better husband. I'm still learning at 58. So that'll let you know that this is a journey, not a destination. And so I wrote poetry, and one of the guys that was in one of the shepherding groups' name was Stan. And Stan wrote poetry too. My grandfather wrote poetry, and I'm thinking about sharing that as either like a perk on Patreon or giving you a taste of what I used to do. In fact, in those days, I didn't teach, so there was no other outlet. And I think it was Janet that said, your poetry sort of functions as your teaching outlet. And so I did a lot of that. And so that's just a little side of me that you have not yet seen, but probably will be brought to you in the near future. And so that was part of it. And when I met my wife, I used to write a lot of poetry. And so we had a love note that we had to write. And there was some serious apology in it because I'm still learning. And I did it in the form of a poem. That is the quickest poem I've ever written. And the scratch outs and the misspellings are proof of it.
Wow.
And so I did my letter to my wife that night, writing a poem in probably about 20 minutes. So that was the quickest attempt at a poem and humble pie that a guy probably has ever had. And Lindsay really loved your comments there. We all have a role, and we're all called to just be, the be in parentheses there, and share our faith we are. I think Paul wrote about us all having a different role in the body.
Right.
Which is a beautiful segue for something there, Lindsay. One of the great loves for Glendall has been the doctrine of the church. Now, I know that. He is an author, and it's nothing as dry as my dissertation. And so he actually published a book that is in my library on the church. And I don't know how you get a hold of that. But if I... Okay, good. When he types that in under private chat, I will put that up there. I do want to let you know that we're thinking, a lot of you guys have asked about my dissertation. I am going to be making that available via Amazon or some sort of electronic publishing in electronic format and orderable. So I haven't forgotten about that. We've just had trouble taking it from the university. And I don't want you going through ProQuest to get the dissertation because ProQuest is going to charge you. And ProQuest is going to charge you what they charge a researcher. And I don't want you to have to pay for that or go through them to get it. It's a really nice copy, but you know what? It's not as accessible. It's not as searchable as an electronic copy would be. And so we're working on that, but we don't want to go through ProQuest, which is where the university has it, and the way researchers use it, have it. We want to go through something that would make it more accessible. So I haven't forgotten about you guys or the interest in the dissertation. But in the meantime, let me let you know about this book here. From Fold to Flock. It's on Amazon also now, too. Excellent. And so it's also on Xylon, and we're looking at both of those as far as the dissertation publishing. Amazon's a little more pricey from what I'm seeing, but I don't know. So
I really can't say for sure. It's been a long time since I've looked on Amazon for my own book. But
there you go.
I do know that it's at Xylon Press.
So that lets you know there. It's a detailed thing. Now, what Neighborhood had was teaching elders. Now, I have to admit, as a guy hanging out in the Southern Baptist Church teaching Sunday school, they don't have the same eldership. I will give you some of the pluses to that type of polity that I have seen over the years. No casting aspersions on where you attend, or even what the churches in your country do, because I don't know. There's probably a plethora in Australia of different setups. One of the advantages was accountability. One of the things that can happen with a guy is that there's no one to balance him. And we, having different gifts and different perspectives, can get out of balance. And so one of the things that's very helpful in having other men is that you have the perspective of different gifts. And by the way, your gift is going to affect your perspective. Okay. I am often taken by Paul's argument structure as an apologist. I'm going to tune in to areas that would create objections for Jewish people. So gifting and calling and all those things. And so it's good to have someone with a different gift there. Okay. And Elizabeth found you on Facebook also. Excellent. Thank you, Elizabeth. I have folks that go out and they even do the research for me. This is too cool. This is a very relaxing evening. That's one of the advantages. The other you need to understand, and Glendall would be the first to point it out to you, is that the terminology used for an elder is also used for a pastor. Okay? So those terms overlap, and what most people do with that is they say, isn't that nice? Well, it's not an accident, and so it's terribly handy. And so they had a 3-elder system when I was there. There were 2 other elders. I remember Kent, and I remember Stan. The poet was also an elder, which was terribly interesting, but none of the stuff that happened when he was eldering ended up in his poetry, which is good policy. And so that's the system they had. Now that probably came from, didn't the Neighborhood Bible Fellowship have a little bit of a background connection to a group of churches? Sort of, not rigidly, but you know.
Yes, we did. That was the original affinity. Of course, Janet and I was looking for a church to find good, solid Bible teaching, and the one that we found. Now, I'm not saying there weren't others out there, but the one that we found that we were most comfortable with was Cape Bible Chapel in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and Mr. Hal Green. And Mr. Green had his background in what some people call the Plymouth Brethren movement. And because of that movement's commitment, especially when it came to the New Testament, very much impressed me, especially when it came to their own ecclesiology, you might say, even though they may hedge against using the term in a formal sense. But their study of the church, their study of the local church in particular, and its governance and its traditions, whatever they might be, were solidly built upon the scriptures and not built upon the traditions of men. That impressed me. I didn't write my book immediately. It took me several decades to actually produce a book out of that, but it came from that experience, and I cannot deny their influence upon me, their influence upon Neighborhood Bible Fellowship, even though we are an independent congregation, which means we're not affiliated with a denomination as such. We carry our own nonprofit corporation and that sort of thing. But we do hold some things very, very dear. And some of those things are just the approach of taking the scriptures, especially the New Testament, that has to do with what it means to gather together as believers in Christ. Jesus, and my title for my book actually comes from Jesus's own prophecy or Jesus' own prediction. He said at one point, "I have other sheep that are not of this fold." Well, in Jesus's context, when he said "this fold," he was talking about his fellow Jewish people. That was the fold. That was what the law of Moses, that's the covenant that God had made with Moses, was a fold. A fold is defined by, guess what? It's defined by a fence. And that's exactly what the law of Moses was. It defined the people inside the fence according to a certain set of prescribed rules, a certain set of what you might even call their own national constitution in the Torah. And that's what Jesus is referring to in those phrases, according to my understanding of that context. He says, "But I have other sheep that are not of this fold." Well, guess what I saw there? I saw that meant that was me. That was me, non-Jewish Gentile. And I'm one of those sheep. And then he makes an interesting prediction right there. He says, "And when I call them and when they come, they will join in one flock." Well, that's an interesting shift of metaphors. Before, he was talking about a fold. Now he's talking about when these other sheep come, there's going to be a flock. Well, what defines a flock? Well, it's certainly not a fence. What defines a flock is the shepherd. The sheep follow the shepherd. And that image, or that caricature there that Jesus describes about his own relationship to not only his own people, but to the Gentiles that will come and to believe in him, that image just struck home to me. So then that became the title for my book, that I felt personally that many of the churches that I had attended growing up and other places, other times that I've attended churches, they seemed to be that they had adopted some church ideas from the New Testament, but they had also adopted some carryovers of what I would call the Old Covenant carryovers. And particularly, I looked at the carryover of the Aaronic priesthood operating in the temple and the New Testament preacher or pastor. And what I began to see, that those are actually two separate roles. There's a little bit of overlap there, but really the definitions change a great deal when it comes to a local church and the pastor and the elders and their role in a congregation. And that's totally different than the Levitical priesthood of the Old Covenant. And that to me was almost like eye-opening, to be set free, not just from what I would call the priesthood prescriptions of the Old Testament, but rather from certain arrangements that the New Testament church had done, or the churches traditionally had done, that took away from the practices that I believe should exist in the local New Testament church. And that's the reason why I came up with that title, was to show that variance, show that demarcation between the two covenants and the way that God prescribed now for the flock to gather around the shepherd, with the under shepherds caring for the sheep. And so that's it. That's about a 20 years worth of experience, and it's put on paper, so you can read it, and whatever mistakes are there, that's what I made over those 20 years.
Interestingly enough, there's a dovetail. My dissertation dealt with reimposing the ceremonial forms of the law on the church, and my strong feelings there. So you're getting a little bit of the passion of Glendall here, and you guys have kind of seen where I've come from and some of those concern, and then the objections around the Trinity, which was a big deal for me. And so this is a question I really love. By the way, Glendall doesn't have it, but Glendall plays guitar. And so I'm going to answer this question, and I'm going to tell you a little story about that. Elizabeth wants to know what type of Christian music you like.
well, I like Christian music. But, I do like contemporary Christian music for the most part. I believe that some parts of it have been influenced by what I would call its marketability. After all, if a musician doesn't get paid, then they won't continue to produce music. But sometimes the downside is in commercializing Christian music, you tend to kind of get what is pop Christian music, which may or may not be very worshipful. But I do believe in contemporary Christian music. I believe that every generation should express themselves back to God with the music of their heart, with the rhythms and the vocals and the lyrics and the poetry and the artistry that come from their own generation, so that they can express it from their heart. If they are too accustomed to just adopting somebody else's music, that may work for a while, but it's something else to actually praise God from your heart language, you might say, not just from a linguistic standpoint, from an artistic standpoint, or from a musical standpoint. So I'm a big believer in adapting music to whatever your audience happens to be.
You won't have any problem with Elizabeth. I've seen her post some Keith Green. I think there's been some early Petra. So all names that, by the way, contemporary gospel music I say that a little bit silly. Our Christian music, I got introduced to Honey Tree, Liberated Wailing Wall, Lamb.
Yes.
You had a group called Bread. They had a song about time. Real life. Michael W. Smith. Yeah. Larry Norman was, I know a little Larry Norman, but he wasn't real big when I was on campus. And so I bordered between the beginnings of what was called Messianic music and contemporary Christian music. Jagarmo and Key, Carmen, little
That's
Carmen
great.
there.
I love it. Well, even back then, they really didn't have the term contemporary Christian music as a category, except it was a derogatory term called Jesus music, and the church people really didn't like it very much. But but it included the same names that you've been listing out. In fact, Larry Norman had the famous quote that said, "Why let the devil have all the good music?" which was like a lightning rod for the people that were producing contemporary Christian music at the time.
Yeah, so that was what I didn't play at home.
No.
Liberated Wailing Wall, I kind of try and sneak in because the imagery was Jewish, and there was kind of the hope that something would be overheard.
Of course. Jeff, I had a question for you in some regards of your own story, because I happen to kind of know at least part of it. I don't know how much of it you shared with your audience in this platform, but I just recently, like a month ago, finished a whole series on the book of Daniel. And I know the book of Daniel played an important role, perhaps, or a specific role, maybe, to you coming to Yeshua. So I know that was a key ingredient, at least, that somebody challenged you to find in the book of Daniel, that the Messiah was presented and was rejected sometime before the destruction of the temple in AD 70, and you had to face that challenge head on. Is that true or not? Did I?
Yeah, that was the last prophecy before I wrote my Gideon Bible. Because really, my concern was, what if I guessed wrong? Okay,
exactly. Yeah.
There were two verses. One comes out of C.S. Lewis, who I'm still a Lewis fan. It was essentially Lewis's comment. He is one of the characters that needs to come to Aslan, and she says, "How do I know you won't destroy me?" And he says, "You can't know, you can only believe." And Jesus said, "If any man will follow me, he will know whether my doctrine is of man or God."
There you go.
And so it was a Lewis type of moment. And then reading Daniel, I could rule out other candidates.
Yes.
So I couldn't say that there were other candidates at the time. And that gave me a cutoff point, that this candidate who matches the criteria, who was around before 70 AD.
Yeah.
And so that's why that played a part. Do I play an instrument? No. I've tried to learn the ocarina. I have a friend who makes me do the cymbals, and I do okay with them. No. The musical part of our family was my mom. And I had an uncle who was a polka king when they had polka music and had his own show. But the poetry stuck a little bit. But the music gene skipped a generation on my side. And so that didn't happen. Someone here, I think it was Slam, who said that she plays guitar, and both of her guitars have a broken high E string. My friend Peter, who used to go on the road, he'd do the music, I'd do the preaching or teaching, has a guitar business. So I could probably get you in touch with him. He used to do guitar strings. And we have a lot of Jeff Peter on the road stories from the days when we were roaming around 3 hours to do Bible studies in Vermont. So I was sort of the circuit rider. I had like 5 Bible studies going in different locations. driving sometimes 2 hours one way to get to one of those Bible studies.
Jeff Wesley Cran.
Yeah, it was it was some late nights, you know, and Peter used to hang with me, and he used to go down, and we used to grab some coffee or something on the road and just hit it. And then sometimes in Vermont, it would snow real bad. I mean, it would snow. And if I couldn't make it all the way home, I'd hit Peter's house and we'd hit the couch, and I'd travel the rest of the way home in daylight when the plows were out. So that was a part of things. And I think the response is probably to Larry Norman being Jewish. Okay. I can restring it, but the music store is closed during COVID. Yeah. I could see how that could happen. Glendall used to do a song, a little bit more of my background. I spent time in a resource room for a learning disability. It isn't intellectual. It's one of the reasons I have trouble writing. My brain thinks, but it doesn't reach my hands. So I had an awful time writing because I can picture the ideas in my head, but I couldn't get them down to my hands. I use dictation software, but that has its problems.
Yeah.
I turned in a paper, and my Hebrew teacher reminded me that Godzilla was a Japanese monster. And my dictation software put in Godzilla where God was supposed to be. And so I had to do a little paper correcting and remove Godzilla from the narrative. It was called Ugly Louise. And it always struck me because I spent time in a resource room with a world that was somewhat scary. I loved to learn and I loved to figure things out, but the world was big and there were just things that didn't work right. And so that song used to just about get me to tear up. And that was a song that Glendall played. And then
that song, by the way, was recorded by a group called Dove. I think they were out of either Oklahoma City or Tulsa, I forget which. And that would have been in the 70s. And if I remember right, the author of that song just passed away recently. I can't remember his name. It's embarrassing. But I sang his song for so many years because Louise was one of those individuals that would have been made fun of most of her life. But the end of the song concludes by saying that Jesus saw that she was beautiful, and he gave his life to make sure that she could be beautiful. And so that's the touching part of that particular song. It's kind of a hook, you might say, to get you to listen to the words and to get you to listen to the fact that Jesus has a purpose for people who are just normal and maybe even dealing with some sort of ostracism or maybe just on the outskirts of most of social interaction. And yet Jesus is able to capture those people and make them beautiful.
So what was fascinating to me is that, Glendall would do the music. I got introduced to conversational prayer. Didn't know you could do that. I remember being in that circle. And then he did this incredible thing with the guitar. While his lovely wife, Janet, was this incredible gal that would disciple the young college gals. And they would sit and talk for hours. And us guys, let them. We didn't, but I just remember their home was kind of a nexus point for the students and for get-togethers way back when. And so that was, it's interesting to see those two talents kind of side by side, or gifting and talent, and that whole thing. So I got introduced to the faith, contemporary Christian music, and the church all pretty much at the same time. None of which I had been exposed to before.
And because Jeff was our resident Jewish believer in Yeshua as his Messiah, then he became a great resource to make sure that us Gentiles weren't too far off track, and so that we wouldn't ostracize him and ostracize other people, even that weren't Jewish, in such a way as to separate them out as if they were somehow second-class Christians because they weren't Gentile Christians or because they weren't didn't have that in their background. And that's one of the values of fellowship in a congregation that is has believers who following Jesus, not only from because they have different gifts that's installed by the Holy Spirit, but also because they have a variety of perspectives because of their cultures, because of their languages, because of the ways they see things cross-culturally, you might say. And Jesus is our way of unifying. He is the one who broke down the barrier. He broke down the wall. He made us into one flock. And so that we don't have to focus on the things that make us different. We focus on the things that make us one. And that's focusing on the shepherd. Otherwise, we do things like the original Corinthian church when they started drawing little fences around each other, saying, well, I'm a Peter, well, I'm a Paul, and I'm of Apollos. And that does nobody any good when Jesus has come to make us one.
Which, by the way, is where Glendall is in his podcasts. I think you finished 1 Corinthians, right?
Yes, I did. Just did my second episode in 2 Corinthians just today. In fact, I put it up line.
Okay, so that's where Glendall is. I found that system interesting as I've learned a little more about the Greek patronage system, and started to, interestingly enough, the church I'm attending has been in Corinthians, and learning about the patronage system, I found it fascinating because that system, Paul is essentially calling people to have Jesus as their patron,
Yes.
as their patron. And I found that interesting because I thought, well, what roles are associated with a patron? And are there any roles in the Old Testament that correspond to patron? And I found the idea of protector.
Yes.
Your patron would protect you. Also, in a sense, your patron would provide you opportunity. And as we discussed on the show on Matthew, what is the reward, or what is the way God rewards? We did the parable of the talent. The guy with 3 coins got 3 more. So one of the great rewards for Christian service is increased opportunity to serve.
Yep.
You're entrusted with more as you handle well as a steward what you already have. So that ties into the parable of the talents, which is where we sort of work. And so I tried to translate Greek terms into Hebrew terms and start looking at Jesus as my patron, and then see which Old Testament sort of pictures matched and crossed over culturally.
Cool.
Which is why I have my Septuagint up, because I like to do which Greek word grabbed this concept that was around that they could, and how do these things tie together? So I'm going to open it up. We're getting near the end here. It's very late it's later where Glendall is. See, I'm just looking forward to dinner. He's looking forward to relaxing. But I do want to allow you guys to ask him some questions. And so if you have any, there's been some good comments. But you got you've got an incredible expository Bible teacher. Now, you got to understand something here. I can't have Glendall teach a complete course on it. Okay? He would have to come back for that. But I do want to give you guys a chance to interact with him too. So I'm opening the queue up a little and seeing if anything comes up that's not just comments, but something that maybe you got curious about when he was talking, and that you were a little interested in. And so I'm going to see if anything.
One thing I'll mention while we're waiting for some feedback, perhaps, was I was curious as a original church planter. We were studying the scriptures about the spiritual gifts and the Holy Spirit giving gifts to various people, and that is part of His variety. In the midst of the unity, He Himself is an author of variety. That is such a fascinating thought, that He intentionally makes us all different and then gives us different spiritual gifts. That doesn't mean that one spiritual gift has a superiority to another. It means that that variety testifies to the Spirit and to his oneness and to his power to give us things that we didn't deserve. And one of the things that I was intrigued about at the time that Jeff was a college student at Southern Illinois University was that he was always one of those college students that asked me questions and would ask me questions no one else would think of. And I remember later talking to the Lord about that, thinking, is that some sort of like an embryonic stage of a spiritual gift that might motivate this guy to become a teacher? After all, that's what teachers do. Teachers ask all the questions that the audience might ask, and then they're able to look for the answers. Whereas otherwise, if you have a person that asks no questions, then they have no idea how to anticipate an audience or what the audience may be thinking or what the audience may be needing at the time. And it was a person who actually asked many questions on a whole spectrum of ideas and a whole spectrum of doctrines that Jeff, in essence, gave me a hypothesis, and it's still a working hypothesis, that a teacher can be discovered perhaps even before he ever starts teaching, but that's his gift because the Spirit puts in him the ability of this insatiable curiosity that will just can't help but just spill over and it becomes fruit after a while. So that's my explanation of Dr. Cran here.
Well, there you go. He's just giving you an explanation that is incredible, and it ties my early Christian experience to what you're seeing now, which I like because I like the connections. You do have a question on the board. Why did you choose podcasts instead of YouTube? Just a little logistical question there.
I'm not sure. I just felt like YouTube is quite cluttered, and I wanted a ministry that would be associated with my name and have my unique flavor on it. I wanted it to be associated with my own domain page. So that's the Podbean was recommended to me by a consultant that told me that that's what these people do. They host your web page, your own domain page, and they come in and they basically create a platform for you to present your own material. And I just tended to kind of like that kind of way of focusing people toward this particular platform rather than a platform that everybody else is using. Although I've been told that Podbean does make it available on the other platforms like YouTube, but I've not pursued that myself. I don't know that it actually works, but that's what they told me when I enrolled.
So that's a good way to go. I've kind of joked we're around 355. I always say we're a small community, but we're mighty.
Yes.
And I don't mind that, but that's another way of doing it. Now, podcasts are usually recorded, right? And then you upload them.
Yes, I very rarely do anything live. I record them first, and then I upload them onto my website. It gives me the ability to edit and go back and redo things. It gives me the ability to rehearse things ahead of time so that I get it the way I want it. And if you listen to the podcasts themselves, you'll discover why in the world this guy do so much rehearsal when he gets it so wrong. But I make a lot of mistakes, but I leave some of the mistakes in there because I still want this to be a non-polished presentation, and yet I want it to be personal. And so I don't want to intentionally just do the stuff that makes people irritable because they're not accustomed to hearing sloppiness. But then again, on the other hand, I want to make it very personable. So it makes it kind of customizable for me. Also, it makes it where they can listen to it themselves and on their own time, and they can pause it when they want to and come back to it later. If they can only listen to 5 minutes of it, then they can come back later. And I intentionally create a break with a musical interlude in the middle of the 30-minute program so that you can actually break it up into 15-minute segments if you care to do it that way. And I did that on purpose so that people wouldn't be obligated to train their ear for an enormous amount of time.
Okay, we're gonna start working things. I got introduced to these guys. All know me probably through getting introduced to YouTube, and we were looking for a way to do ministry, and we landed here, and the field wasn't what we expected. I jokingly say God found a way for me to teach. He found a way to make it work. I love your guys' comments. They spur me on. See, your questions spur additional questions and make me think of new questions. And so I like answering your questions because as I see your questions, then I have to think through, if I was asking this question, where would I go? How would I reason? And what do I always tell you? I tell you, I'll give you how I arrived at it, the trip, and you can decide to take the trip or not. See, I'll show you how I got there, and then you can come along for the ride or not. So Slam has a little question. No, I don't do the wow thing. I do the vav thing. I know that's become popular. It's a Hebrew letter. I always joke my daughter was hit with the wow thing. There's a Hebrew letter that's sometimes pronounced wow. You can even, wow. And the problem is that they're taking the Arabic W sound instead of treating it as a V sound. And my daughter's reply when she got hit with that, and she grew up around Hebrew, was it was King David, not David, not King Daweed. And that was her response. So I avoid the wow thing.
I love it.
Chris has a good question for you, though. Your life verse is the Philippians verse, is it?
Yes. Philippians 21.
He also...
Yes.
Okay.
For me to live is Christ and to die is gain.
Okay. And what was your favorite book to exposit?
Ooh. That's a good question. I still like presenting the book of Philippians. I think it's one of Paul's personable books. It's also one that includes a portion of his story that isn't so much about the history or the encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus and that part of his story. It's more the theological part of his story of what this meant for a Pharisee, an ex-Pharisee, you might say, to find this new walk with the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, in such a fashion as to then find himself in the ministry to a bunch of Gentile churches. That whole thing is so fascinating, and it's laid out pretty dramatically and poetically, by the way, in Philippians chapter 3. And that is my favorite passage, even though the verse comes from earlier in the book. I love expositing Philippians. It's one of my favorite books. But I have been through Romans several different times, and I love going through Romans. And I think that is a foundational book. I like the book of Revelation. Somebody told me one time, well, they don't like even reading the book of Revelation because it scares them too much. And I said, don't you realize that the real story behind the book of Revelation is that Jesus is going to return and get rid of all the stuff he doesn't like? That really shouldn't scare us much. He's going to keep all the stuff he does like. And that's an encouraging thing, because if you are trusting him as your substitute, your sin substitute on your behalf, then you see he is one of the people that is now he's coming for. And he wants you to be a part of his family, and he wants you to be a part of his kingdom and his eternity. And that is something to take great comfort in, not something to be afraid of. He's and even though there's lots of dramatic things in the book of Revelation, it is also one of the books I like to talk about. Now, if you talk about the Old Testament, I've already mentioned it. The book of Daniel is the absolute pinnacle of anything I've done out of the Old Testament. And I've done several books, not the entire books left of Matthew, but I have done a few, and Daniel is definitely my favorite.
Okay, well, that answers the after that, and you got a me too. I have to admit, the first gospel that made sense to me was Matthew. The book of Hebrews, I have an incredible, deeper appreciation for, as I look at the way God wants to bring oneness back to him, between himself and his creation, at one-ment, atonement.
Yes.
And then the way, the superiority of the new covenant.
Exactly.
So we're at the hour mark. And I know that it's much later where Glendall is. You could see, because like his background's darker. No, that's just my light.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to, I don't know if I'm going to close on this or whether you want to close on it or not, but I did want to at least leave this thought out there, because I have, at least within the last year or two, done the book of Romans, and I just want to underline that Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11 really does outline that this is part of God's plan to bring in what we call the ecclesia, but that work of God that we call by that name, the assembly of Christ, that is not a replacement for the covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that the Messiah will complete that covenant. And there is a lot going on in some Christian circles these days that want to make the church a replacement for the Jewish people and the nation of Israel. And I have to just come down hard, or come down at least preparing my brothers and sisters in such a fashion to say that is just wrong. Romans 9, 10, 11 says that God isn't done with the nation of Israel. He's not done with the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yes, there are things that he will need to do to bring them into the kingdom. And that's for another time and another place. But I did want to at least bring part of my contribution to this program today, that I believe that God is going to bring the nation of Israel back to himself and back to Yeshua to complete his work in history on this earth, with the throne of David being occupied by the Messiah, the Son of the living God.
Well, no argument here, and I absolutely love it. I did not have a lordship issue. I had a king issue. So I know who my king is. So that is absolutely great. Elizabeth has been attending a study in Australia on Daniel. And so I do that. Hey, look, we're all fellow workers for the same king here. So let me pop that up, make my little drink thing. It's time to drink water. I will. When you're in the desert, you remember to drink water, or you just dry up and blow away. It's just the way it is. I'm going to let Glendall go. And tomorrow night, we're back in Matthew. We will actually be, and I'm looking at where we are. We're going to be dealing with the Last Supper, the beginning. We've already dealt with some reasons why Judas might have become disillusioned. And we're going to deal with the fact that the Last Supper was a Passover Seder, why some people think it isn't, why it was, and how that affects the chronology of the evening. Brother Steve, who is incredible, says thank you so much, and come back, and we'll see about doing that and figuring out how to do that in the future. I am not going to roll. Now, Patreon says that I roll the credits thanking people. I'm going to do that tomorrow. I make sure that happens each week. People support us through Chosen People. Some support us through Patreon. That's why I have the cool second monitor and the nice mic here. So I will do that tomorrow, and we will finish up for tonight. Thank you guys for being here. I know there'll be people watching it after. I hope many take the opportunity to listen to Glendall and to check out the podcasts. So I'm going to say Erev Tov. I have a few people that are taking up a little Hebrew to understand their Bibles better, which is good evening. And I'm going to say goodbye to Glendall, and you could just go ahead, log off, and I'll hit the end broadcast button.
My brother, it's been a real treasure. Thank you.
It's been a joy. So let me end.